Welcome to Getting It On with James and Heather. I'm Heather Dawn.
And I'm James Guay, and we're here dishing out sex, love, and relationship advice, aren't we?
Yes, and without any of that snobby stuff. Overcoming toxic relationships. I know that's a topic that no one can relate to.
Right? None of us have been in it.
I'm laughing. I'm like, meanwhile, I spent years crying.
Right.
So funny now.
Yeah, hello. With a little distance. But this is an all too frequent thing. Certainly something that people come in to us to talk about. You as a life coach, me as a therapist, right?
Definitely.
It's all too common.
You know, it's interesting when you're by yourself and you're not in a relationship or you're just sort of single and dating, you know, you're not really exposed to a lot of toxicity with others or with yourself. I mean, in dating, you can see it sometimes pretty quickly, sometimes you can't. But the sort of beauty of getting into a we or a you and a me is that you suddenly will start to see things that aren't always pleasurable and can be downright toxic. And I think we should be really clear as to what a toxic relationship is, because we can all be toxic from time to time.
Absolutely.
You know, so toxic relationships happen continuously. It's a continual behavior that's given from a toxic person to another that puts you down, is abusive emotionally or physically, causes damage, that there's more bad than there is good on a continual level. Right?
That's really an important distinction, because it's not a one-off, it's not an outlier where occasionally someone says something really mean or hurtful or demeaning of you. This is about a continual, like you said, a continual behavior. So it's about intensity, it's about frequency, and it's also about how you feel in relationship with another. If you're feeling so devalued or so demeaned, or you don't have a right to exist, all of these things could be indicators that either your past is getting activated and you need to look at stuff, or that you're in a relationship with someone who's toxic. Right?
And I just want to say that, you know, there's a very big difference between emotional abuse and physical abuse. And then in the physical abuse realm, there's also some things to understand. You know, some people take a zero tolerance to physical abuse. And I think that I would feel the same way. Like if you're talking about your partner suddenly punches you in the eye or the stomach, or whips out a weapon and assaults you, or you know, does something that's really, really seriously life-threatening.
Right, if there's a history of that sort of violence that they have too, right?
That is a zero tolerance. That's not like, oh, let me see if I can work this out, right? That's you needing to get away from that relationship. No discussions, no anything. Find yourself a good therapist, and you need to deal with that. But sometimes there's like one-offs on violence, meaning a person that has no history of violence whatsoever suddenly just shoves you. Yeah, except they're not as dramatic as that.
Although maybe there is a lot of drama connected to it, you know.
Yeah, and not to obviously make light on drama, but again, when you're one step away from violence, when you've moved back, you know, there's humor in things that you're not directly involved with, but there's nothing funny about being involved or the victim of having been physically abused. Or emotionally for that matter. But I just want to say that when we're talking toxic relationships, there is some scenarios where, let's say you've been with someone for years and suddenly there was a shove. Or I knew of a couple that came to me, and I have to keep their name. They were constantly throwing things at each other. They would throw wallets, they would throw wine glasses, they would throw pillows, you know, and things would get escalated, you know, for me, that would be, you know, I'd be like, goodbye. But for somebody else, that's another thing. Now, if you have two people that are then willing to go to therapy under those circumstances and nobody's life has been threatened, then maybe there's a way to salvage that particular relationship. But high levels of violence, continual violence, no, and no.
Well, and I also think that there's another point here, that physical violence can be really easily determined, in the sense that, you know, it's concrete, it's physical, right? You can see it with your eyes, versus emotional or psychological violence or abuse. It's a little bit more, you know, incendiary. It's a little bit less distinct at times. You know how you feel, but feelings, you know, aren't as visible sometimes as physical altercations
and
can
also
be.
to remember, it is illegal to put your hands on somebody in an act of violence. You can be arrested for that.
Sure.
You can't be arrested for calling someone a jerk.
And let's talk about some of the tactics that are used in relationship, psychological warfare,
Yes.
emotional toxicity, right? A large one that a lot of people talk about is gaslighting.
Oh, yeah.
Right? It's this idea that if that your reality doesn't exist as you imagine it. Yeah. So the person that's maybe narcissistic or sociopathic,
you're just making
has
that up.
Antisocial personality disorder, is manipulative.
Oh, I don't know what you're talking about.
There it is, right?
No, James, I really don't know what you're talking about.
It never happened.
I don't know what you're saying. I mean, I don't even believe in gaslighting. It's so stupid.
Great example. Thank you, Heather.
No, yeah, really. I really think you should go back and relook at your LMFT.
Right. So it makes it makes the receiver question their own perception, their own sense of reality, their own intuition. Like, oh, maybe I exaggerated or made it up, or it never happened, or
no, it happened. If you're continuously made to feel that what you know to be truth is doubtable or unstable, and again, it's just factually. I mean, you can't disprove it. It's like you're being gaslit, and that's not okay. That is an emotionally abusive tactic, and if it happens all the time, get out and get out quickly.
Right.
What would be another good example?
Well, it can be love bombing, and then in reverse, sort of opposite extremes, right? Like just pouring lots and lots of love and intensity towards you. You feel wonderful. It often happens during the honeymoon phase of the cycle of violence, right?
I have personally experienced that. Have you ever experienced that?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, it's the worst.
Well, it feels good in the moment.
Oh, it feels amazing at the start, yeah.
And that's what keeps people drawn in oftentimes, right? But then there's also this opposite reaction where you are the worst person, you are hated upon, you are devalued like you are the scum of the earth.
That's a very NPD, narcissistic personality disorder, which we'll talk about in another episode. But that's a very typical tactic for someone who has NPD, narcissistic personality disorder. I always tell my clients that if somebody's coming out to you, and it's in those first several days, and oh my God, you're the best thing in the world, you're the one I've been waiting for, run. If you're doubting it, trust that doubt and run. It's lovely to be flattered, and you should thank them for the flattery.
Right.
Or if you don't run, don't suck it up. You should already know how good you are before you got there. You didn't need that validation.
Yeah.
And knowing how good you are is not ego. They're like, no, I know what I'm worth. I mean, it's not that.
Right.
It's just a healthy sense of self-esteem, which we'll get into shortly.
Well, and again, this is part of what draws us in. If we didn't get validated, if we have those kinds of doubts, self-doubts or insecurities, it can feel really good because we all need validation, right?
Correct.
And we all need to self-validate, like you're talking about, so that we're less reliant exclusively on another person to make us feel worthy and of value, and that we have some of that inside that's happening too.
Correct.
Right?
And another tactic might be, let's say, bait and switch. Oh, no, I'm going to do this for you. And then it's just like, no, we're going to do this.
Right.
And it's done continuously. Again, I can't stress this enough. In a toxic relationship, what defines it from ordinary people just acting like jerks, because it happens, none of us are perfect.
Right.
It's continual.
Right. It's the level of severity and frequency and consistency, like you're talking about. So another sort of bait and switch example can be that they evoke something. It's sort of like an invitation for a fight or an argument. You take the bait and then they switch it up on you. Or like it's another kind of aspect of projection where they put all their angst onto you. You hold it, you act it out, and then you're like, wait, what just happened? Now they're acting like they're the innocent person and you're the bad person, and there's some evidence to
say otherwise.
Yeah.
So those are just some examples of tactics that can occur. And then, some other examples of how you would feel in a toxic relationship. You'd be made to feel less than, stupid, not good enough. The bad outweighs the good. Your partner likes to disappear without communication for months or weeks on end, and then comes back like, hey, honey, and it's just like, what? And where did you go?
Right.
You can't be yourself. You're being manipulated and controlled all the time. I want you to do this, I want you to do this, and if you say no, all hell breaks loose, or you'll get shamed, right? There's a lot of instability and drama. You notice lots of lying happening. And then, of course, a toxic person who is really uber toxic will refuse to change.
Right.
Now, that's a common element of NPD again, but other people, abusers that are not NPDs, when you suggest, hey, I think we need therapy, or you need therapy, or let's go discuss this, and they're just completely resistant to it and then push it on to you,
Right.
total toxic behavior.
Yeah, it's not taking ownership for their own responsibility. It's always projected onto the other person because there's such a deflated sense of self that their existence requires, right, that other people sort of mirror who they are so that they can exist. So without that mirror, without that validation from someone else, without that attention, even if it's negative from someone else, their worst fear comes to fruition, that they don't exist, that they're annihilated in some way, right? That's how it feels for someone who's that narcissistic.
You know, and what you were just talking about, or it was just you were talking about self-worth and self-esteem, you know, when you wonder who gets into toxic relationships, anybody who suffers from a sense of low self-esteem, even though you may not be aware that you have self-esteem issues, which is more often or not the case, you know, and a lot of that is also rooted into underlying insecurity. Sorry, there was like a little gnat that just flew.
You know.
I was a toxic gnat.
Exactly. Pause.
But yeah, so believe it or not, in a toxic relationship, both partners suffer from low self-esteem. The one who's staying in the relationship, who's being abused all the time, and the one who's doing the abusing, you actually share that in common. Both people.
Yeah, and these kinds of relationships can evoke lower self-esteem in someone than they originally had to begin with, right?
Correct.
So it usually starts out, you know, with romance and love and affection and the honeymoon phase, and everything seems good. So that's the buy-in. You're like, oh, this is like the best relationship I've never had, right? But then slowly or incrementally over time, you recognize that there's these subtext, and again, the toxicity starts to rise, the self-esteem starts to lower. Self-esteem is something that isn't always constant. It can fluctuate throughout our lives. So even if in one moment you're like, I love myself, I'm confident, great self-esteem, there can be moments when that lowers, and certainly toxic relationships can do that too.
You know, but when you're also looking at self-esteem, you know, and who gets into these toxic relationships, and as Jane was saying, you're also asking the question, why do we stay?
Yeah.
I mean, we've all been, both us as a life coach, James as a therapist, you know, in listening just as a friend to somebody else's toxic relationship stories, because we've all done that job. You know, you're sitting here, why is this person staying there? Are they crazy? Why is this person stay there?
Right.
Now, there's lots of reasons. But again, if you want to get into the root, and it's always good to use the root to propel you forward. I'm not a big fan of going into therapy for years on end and retelling the same painful childhood traumatic story.
No,
right?
I'm not either.
You want to discover the root, like where did my self-esteem get broken? And when you do, you have to look at who raised you, your parents, your grandparents, you know, a community of people.
That imprint of people, the models of being in a relationship.
And how they interacted.
And how they interacted with you.
How your legal guardians interacted and how they interacted with you, because that's where you learned. And it's not to finger point and blame, because there really was no book or educational system in place for people to learn how to interact healthy.
Sure.
We just learned by moving and going and living. But once you discover where your low self-esteem root happened, like for example, you may have had a parent who was really, really loving, but then could also be equally as abusive. And so you learned, and I'm going to take this as a quote from something I read, that if you're nice to me, you're allowed to hurt me. Right? When you have a parent that, or a legal guardian that had raised you in that way, really loving and then equally as abusive, your brain translates that into, if you're nice to me, you're allowed to hurt me.
Right.
And so, by the way, you take that pattern, which has now been imprinted in your brain as a kid, and that's what you start to seek unknowingly, right? But it's the knowing and the awareness that's going to get you out of these relationships.
Well, and there's another quality in behavioral science where it's intermittent, unpredictable rewards is what draws people in.
The reinforcement.
And it's so in other words, if someone occasionally, once in a while, gives you just feeds you so well, emotionally or otherwise, even if it's 1 out of 10 times, you starve yourself waiting for that drop of water, right? Or
that's when you have low self-esteem.
It's crumb love, right? You're waiting around for that little bit that satiates you for a period of time. If it happens incrementally, occasionally, unpredictably, that tends just, our systems tend to be wired towards getting attracted to that type of reward.
Yep. And so when you're looking at why do we stay, and just in a very brief example, because James and I will actually be doing this topic much more in depth over the next year.
Sure.
You're really looking at your cognition, your thought process, your emotions, which are learned behaviors, your habits, which are the actions of those learned behaviors, and then the discipline you have to stay in them or to get out of them. Okay. And so why do people stay? It's not just cognitive. God, that's so illogical. Why are they staying? It's not just cognition. Your cognition versus emotion, habit, and discipline. When all those things come into play, you can either stay in the toxicity or get out of it. But James and I will get into that further in depth in upcoming seminars, webinars, and workshops we have.
Yeah, and just to weave in there, oftentimes we grow up in environments, like you're saying, that are invalidating or that say it's not okay being who you are. And we can formulate different core beliefs and ways of being in the world to try and receive love, right? That can help. I mean, it's brilliant the way that we're able to do this growing up in order to try and get our needs met. But in adulthood, it can stop working or come at too high a price, like being in a relationship like this, where we actually have to start to look at, okay, what are the core beliefs about myself? Like I'm unlovable or those kinds of things. And how can I switch that, not just on a cognitive level, but a physiological, felt sense, experiential level, and that's part of what Heather's talking about that we'll go into further later.
So now we want to break free, okay? And in its most simplest form, we're looking at awareness, your willingness to leave, owning your part in it. You can't just be blaming a toxic partner.
Yeah.
You chose to stay there for some reason, with consciousness or without. You have to discover why. Learning how to set boundaries, and then having the discipline to get out and stand by those boundaries or to work through that relationship, right?
Yeah, there can be a lot of secondary gains for staying in relationships like this, right? Maybe there's a fear of boredom, a fear of what would life be like without. Maybe the drama feels like you're more alive, or it's sort of repetition compulsion where you're consistently doing something, reenacting something in your adult life that played out in earlier life, and you're trying to learn from it, but you're not doing it in ways consciously, like we're talking about, that actually allows you to heal from the experience versus just get re-traumatized by the experience.
Right.
So looking at those underlying causes, those secondary gains, what keeps you invested, what keeps you into it, is a huge part of this process.
Yep, but first and foremost, become aware.
Awareness, insight, got to know what's going on, right?
Your willingness to leave. If the therapy doesn't work out, if the personal transformation doesn't work out, you have to be willing to leave this relationship. No qualms. No movement can be had unless you know that if things don't get better, you are going to leave, and not just threaten to. Otherwise, that toxic partner will stay in charge forever.
Yeah.
You have to be willing to leave. What James was just talking about, owning and discovering what your part was in it. And also forgiving yourself once you have discovered those things. Most people will just browbeat themselves. Really important that when you discover that weakness, that sort of shameful part, that part that got you in toxicity, you have to learn how to forgive that.
Yeah, one of the things that I talk about a lot too is the tools of mindfulness and compassion, right? If we're judging what we're discovering about ourselves and why we're in relationships, that stuff is not going to come to the surface in order for us to work with it and learn and grow and do it different, right? We need to be loving, caring, compassionate with ourselves and the material that we don't like about ourselves, that shadow material, right?
Yep.
The stuff that's like we'd rather just like repress, deny, ignore, put in the other corner, that keeps us in these kinds of relationships, right? Instead, bring it to the light of day, look at it in a compassionate way so that we can shift it.
Great. Set boundaries.
Yes, boundaries,
No
right?
is a word that is non-negotiable. When you use the word no wisely, It's not used just to generate argument or just to be abstinent. No means no. No means that I have a certain amount of morals and values that I would like to keep intact.
Yeah, it's requiring that the other person treat you with respect.
Yep.
Right? That you are worthy of that respect. So not just setting boundaries, but maintaining them. Because if you wiggle, if you let someone else sort of continually step over those boundaries and you acquiesce, then that's more fuel for a toxic relationship to continue.
Exactly. And that's exactly why the last one was discipline. You have to reinforce it with discipline.
Over and over and over again. Consistency.
So
not easy stuff, right?
Not easy, but you have a good start point in order to get out of or overcome your toxic relationships. And again, look to future things that we will be doing both in webinars and workshops
fun.
On how to overcome your toxic relationships. We know you can do it. Find yourself a good support group. I'm Heather Dawn.
And I'm James Guay. And check us out. Our website is thejamesandheathershow.com. And the phone number to call us with any questions is right below. We'd love to hear from you and put you on our show.
Yep.